Built 1881, this Ravensbourne boarding house was the home for Terence Brian Donovan after he returned home from the war. It was also briefly the home of Terence and his new bride Eileen, née Holland, following their marriage. The next move was to rent a state house in Corstorphine, a duplex or single building divided into two houses. The Donovans on the right.
The beginning of the vegetable garden. Terence, or Brian as he preferred to be called, took to every house the family moved to from this time on. The house would also be the home for the first addition to the Donovan family. Brian Jr. the first to arrive, seen here with Auntie Doreen. Then one became two and a sister. Then there was three with a brother. 3 children in a 2-bedroom house is not ideal for long. The Donovan family's first house, 16, Derby Street, Green Island. Young Brian can be seen in the front, looking up Derby Street nearly 70 years later. Just around the corner at 20, Church Street lived Terence Brian's parents, and where he lived for a time before the war. A more recent photo of the Church Street house where young Brian spent some time with his grandmother all those years earlier. A few drinks at neighbor's house, 18, Church Street. The same house today. 16, Derby Street is where young Brian along with his siblings grew up. It had 3 bedrooms, a basic shower over bath, separate toilet, small lounge and smallish kitchen dining space. Damian Donovan, the only one of the next generation, young Brian's firstborn to spend time at Derby Street in the 1970s. Here he is in the lounge in front of the main form of heating, the coal and coke burner. Many a happy hour was spent in landscaped garden and lawn area, knocked into shape from hours and hours of backbreaking toil. Underneath the house and usually bordered by tomato plants was the cellar, and home for workbench, tools, screws, kindling, coal, bikes, seed potatoes and all manner of items Terence Brian used and reused or made. At his point, we are going back into a brief snapshot of Green Island where Brian Donovan spent nearly 16 years, and here we see maybe the first house in 1857. Jumping forward to 1906, and the Green Island Main Street. And the Presbyterian Church from the same year, still around when Brian was growing up, but demolished when he was living in Australia. Further views of early Green Island. This early photo shows Green Island School to the middle right. To the left up the hill is a view of the area where Derby Street would eventually be created. This is a view of the church and primary school at a time Brian was attending in the 1960s. The last perspective is a Green Island Main Street view from 1980, by that time Brian was living in Christchurch. Before leaving Derby Street, here is a quick look at Damian's visit from Australia in the late 1970s, showing how tidy the house was in those days. These recent views of the same house show much of the many years of hard work put in nearly 70 years earlier by Terence Brian, is now hard to find. Brian was now an Otago University student and moved into a flat in the city with 5 women, and luckily as a result his cooking skills were never tested. Completing his degree he moved to Christchurch into a flat at 29 Mayfair Street adjacent to Hagley Park, but found his flatmates a weird bunch and moved on as soon as he could find new digs. 101 Salisbury Street was to be a complete contrast, with his flatmates having a variety of tradie backgrounds and predominantly Maori. The house was to become a party house from the start with barely a weekend free of fun times. The time came, however, on completing his secondary teaching course, to consider the future and namely, to escape the education department for life in Australia. Living with fellow Kiwi Susan Osmond, Brian and Sue lived in 5 Sydney addresses from the central city, and eventually out to the long-term accommodation in Bondi. A more recent picture of the modernised Bondi flat. The return of Sue, Brian, and two young toddlers Damien and Bradley to New Zealand due to family circumstances saw them in a rental flat in Meervale, Christchurch. A two-bedroom flat was never going to be ideal for the family for too long, and it was time to go to the bank and a mortgage of 19% interest approved. A house was purchased and a new chapter begun. Follow that journey in part 2 of this look at Brian and the Donovan family houses.